Mark and Evelyn exchanged confused, sidelong glances, their faces etched with a mixture of irritation and apprehension. Nathan and Claire, trailing behind them, seemed equally perplexed, Nathan scrolling mindlessly through his phone, his disinterest radiating outwards, Claire's expression a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "Dad, what's this about?" Mark asked impatiently, his voice edged with a barely concealed annoyance, breaking the strained silence as they entered the lawyer's office. Mr. Whitmore glanced at Alina, a silent reassurance passing between them, then turned to face his family, his gaze sweeping over their anxious faces before settling on the lawyer, a composed figure seated across the polished mahogany table. "I've made some decisions," he announced, his voice steady, surprisingly strong despite his recent illness. "Decisions about my legacy." The room fell silent, the hushed anticipation punctuated only by the soft hum of the air conditioning. The lawyer, a man accustomed to navigating the delicate intricacies of family dynamics and testamentary intentions, cleared his throat, a subtle signal that the proceedings were about to begin. He opened a thick bound document, its pages crisp and official, and began to read, his voice measured and formal, filling the silence with the legal pronouncements that would irrevocably alter the landscape of the Whitmore family's future. As he spoke, the family's initial confusion gradually morphed into stunned disbelief, then hardened into open shock, and finally, erupted into incandescent outrage. Mr. Whitmore, the lawyer explained, had arranged for a significant, indeed a substantial portion of his estate, a sum that represented a lifetime of accumulated wealth and privilege, to be bequeathed, not to his children, not to his grandchildren, but to Alina Reyes. "What?" Mark erupted, slamming his hand on the polished table, the sudden violence of the gesture echoing through the silent office. "This is ridiculous. She's just a caregiver." "She's more than that, Mark," Mr. Whitmore replied sharply, his voice rising above the stunned exclamations of his family, his gaze unwavering as it met his son's incredulous stare. "Alina has been there for me when none of you were. She saved my life. Not just physically but emotionally. She gave me dignity when all I felt was neglect." Evelyn's face, already pale, flushed a mottled red. "You can't seriously expect us to be okay with this," she exclaimed, her voice rising in pitch, laced with disbelief and fury. "She's manipulating you. She's playing you." Alina's breath caught in her throat, the accusations hitting her like physical blows. "I never," she began, her voice trembling, attempting to defend herself against the onslaught of their anger, their misjudgment. But Mr. Whitmore raised a hand, a gesture of authority that silenced the rising tide of protest. "This isn't about manipulation," he stated firmly, his voice cutting through the charged atmosphere, his gaze unwavering. "This is about gratitude and fairness. Alina deserves this." The family protested, their voices overlapping, a cacophony of heated arguments, accusations, and wounded entitlement. But Mr. Whitmore remained unyielding, his resolve hardened by years of observation, by a lifetime of accumulated wisdom. He turned to Alina, his expression softening, a gentle warmth replacing the steel in his gaze. "You've given me more than I could ever repay, Alina," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "But this is a start." For the first time in her life, Alina felt truly seen, truly acknowledged, not just for what she did, but for who she was, for the quiet strength of her character, for the unwavering kindness that had touched a life so profoundly different from her own. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the faces of the stunned Whitmore family, blurring the stark lines of the lawyer's office. She struggled to find the right words, to express the overwhelming rush of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. "Thank you, Pa," she whispered, her voice trembling, barely audible above the rising din of the family's protests. "But I didn't do this for anything in return." "I know," Mr. Whitmore said, a faint knowing smile gracing his lips, a quiet affirmation of her selfless devotion. "That's what makes you deserving." As the lawyer finalized the paperwork, the legal pronouncements echoing in the stunned silence, Alina realized that this moment, this unexpected turn of events, wasn't just about the inheritance, about the sudden shift in her financial reality. It was about something far deeper, far more profound. It was about the recognition of her humanity, her inherent worth, her unwavering kindness in a world that often seemed to value only material possessions and social status. For the first time, in a world that had so often rendered her invisible, Alina Reyes felt like she truly belonged. The tension in the lawyer's office hung heavy in the air, a palpable storm cloud long after the meeting concluded. Mark and Evelyn stormed out, their anger radiating outwards, their protests still echoing in the hushed hallway. Nathan and Claire, trailing behind them, shook their heads in disbelief, their faces a mixture of confusion and embarrassment. Alina sat frozen, unsure of what to do, what to say, the enormity of what had just transpired still sinking in. As the lawyer quietly gathered the paperwork, his expression neutral, professional, Mr. Whitmore reached out, his frail hand covering hers, a gesture of quiet reassurance. "Let them cool off, Alina," he said, his voice calm despite the lingering chaos. "They'll come around eventually. Or not. Either way, I'm at peace with my decision." "Pa, Mr. Whitmore," Alina began hesitantly, her voice thick with emotion, I don't know how to thank you. It's too much. So much." "It's not enough, Alina," Mr. Whitmore interrupted gently, his gaze unwavering. "Not for everything you've done for me. You gave me something my own family couldn't. Genuine care. That's worth more than money, Alina." Alina's emotions swirled, a complex tapestry of gratitude, disbelief, and a faint undercurrent of unease. She had never asked for recognition, had never sought reward, let alone something so life-changing, so profoundly unexpected. But as Mr. Whitmore's words sank in, resonating deep within her, a new feeling emerged, a quiet but powerful sense of validation. After years of quiet sacrifice, of selfless devotion, of feeling unseen and unheard, someone of immense stature in a world that often overlooked her, had finally truly seen her for who she was, not just for what she did. That evening, back at the estate, the Whitmore family confronted Mr. Whitmore again, their resentment simmering beneath the surface, threatening to boil over. The air in the grand living room was heavy with unspoken accusations, with wounded entitlement. Mark was the first to speak, his tone sharp and accusatory, his carefully constructed composure finally cracking. "Dad, what were you thinking? Leaving that kind of money to a stranger?" "She's not a stranger, Mark," Mr. Whitmore replied firmly, his voice rising above the simmering tension, his gaze unwavering as it met his son's angry stare. "Alina has been more present in my life than any of you. When I needed help, she was there. When I needed a friend, she listened. Can any of you say the same?" Mark bristled, his face flushing with anger, but he didn't respond, the unspoken truth of his father's words hanging heavy in the air. Evelyn stepped in, her voice cold, controlled, laced with a carefully veiled contempt. "This isn't about care or gratitude, Dad," she said, her words precise, cutting. "It's about manipulation. She's taking advantage of you, in your vulnerable state." Alina, who had been standing quietly in the corner of the room, observing the unfolding drama with a heavy heart, finally spoke up, her voice clear and steady, surprisingly strong in the face of their collective hostility. "I've never asked for anything from Mr. Whitmore," she stated, her hands trembling slightly but her gaze unwavering. "I came here to do my job, to help him. That's all." Mr. Whitmore raised a hand, silencing the escalating argument with a decisive gesture. "Enough," he commanded, his voice firm, final. "This isn't a debate. My decision is final." Evelyn glared at Alina, her eyes narrowed with suspicion, with undisguised resentment. "You may have fooled him," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom, "but you haven't fooled us. We'll be watching you." Alina felt a pang of fear, a cold knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach, but she held her ground, her gaze steady, unwavering. "I've done nothing wrong, ma'am," she replied, her voice quiet but resolute. "I just want what's best for Mr. Whitmore." The following days at the estate were tense, fraught with unspoken accusations and simmering resentments. The family barely spoke to Alina, their glances cold, their interactions clipped and formal. Their glares, she could feel them, followed her like shadows, filled with suspicion, with judgment. She tried to focus on her work, on Mr. Whitmore's continued recovery, but the weight of their collective disapproval, their unspoken hostility, loomed over her, a heavy cloud obscuring the quiet satisfaction she usually found in her work. Despite the pervasive tension, despite the family's palpable animosity, Mr. Whitmore remained steadfastly supportive, his quiet strength, though limited physically, giving Alina the courage to persevere, to weather the storm. One afternoon, Mr. Whitmore called Alina into his study, a room that exuded an old-world charm, smelling of leather and aged paper, a space that seemed untouched by the rest of the house's cold modern aesthetic. He motioned for her to sit across from him, his gaze serious, his expression thoughtful. "Alina," he began, his voice low and steady, "I know this isn't easy for you." Alina nodded silently, her gaze lowered, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "But you need to understand something," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "My family's anger. It isn't really about you, Alina. It's about themselves. They're upset because my decision, it forced them to see what they've been ignoring for years. Their own neglect." Alina nodded slowly, her gaze still lowered, absorbing his words, recognizing the quiet wisdom in his assessment. I don't want to cause trouble, Pa," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "For your family. You're not causing trouble, Alina," he said firmly, his voice leaving no room for doubt. "You're opening their eyes. And maybe, just maybe, there's two. Change is never easy, Alina. But it's necessary." A week later, something unexpected, something that shifted the tectonic plates of the Whitmore family dynamic, happened. Claire, the youngest of Mr. Whitmore's grandchildren, approached Alina in the garden, a hesitant figure against the backdrop of sculpted greenery. Claire, usually aloof, absorbed in her own world of social media and teenage preoccupations, seemed different today, her usual detachment replaced by a tentative openness. "Hey, Alina," Claire said awkwardly, shyly tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. Can I talk to you?" Alina was surprised, caught off guard by Claire's unexpected approach, but she nodded, a flicker of hope igniting within her. "Of course, Claire." Claire hesitated, shifting her weight from one foot to the other, looking down at her hands, her usual confidence replaced by a nervous vulnerability. "I wanted to say, sorry," she mumbled, her voice barely audible, "for the way my family has been treating you. It's not fair." Alina's heart softened, a wave of warmth washing over her at Claire's unexpected apology. "Thank you, Claire," she replied gently, her voice filled with quiet gratitude. "That means a lot. I guess I just never really thought about everything you do for Grandpa," Claire admitted, her gaze lifting to meet Alina's for the first time, her eyes surprisingly earnest. "But after what happened, I realized how much he relies on you. And how much you care." Alina smiled gently, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "He's a good man, Claire," she said softly. "He deserves to be cared for." Claire nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, a flicker of genuine emotion breaking through her usual teenage detachment. "He talks about you all the time, you know," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "How you remind him of Grandma. I think she'd be proud of what you're doing." Alina felt a lump form in her throat, a rush of emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "That's very kind of you to say, Claire," she managed to whisper, her voice thick with emotion. As Claire walked away, disappearing back into the grand house, Alina felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile sense of optimism. Perhaps not all of the Whitmores were blind to the truth, to the quiet heroism of her everyday care. And perhaps in time, the rest of the family, even Mark and Evelyn, would come to see what Claire had begun to understand, to acknowledge the quiet revolution that had begun in their own home, orchestrated by the gentle hands and unwavering heart of Alina Reyes. The estate seemed quieter than usual in the weeks that followed, but the undercurrent of tension was louder than ever. The Whitmore family's resentment, though somewhat subdued after Claire's unexpected apology, still simmered beneath the surface, a low hum of unspoken hostility. Their interactions with Alina were reduced to curt nods, clipped sentences, and a palpable distance that felt more like a wall than a social space. Evelyn, in particular, seemed determined to find fault in everything Alina did, scrutinizing her every action, from the way she prepared Mr. Whitmore's meals to the precise dosage of his medications. One afternoon, while Alina was tidying the sunroom, arranging the magazines on the polished coffee table, she overheard Mark and Evelyn speaking in hushed tones in the hallway just outside the open doorway. She couldn't make out every word, their voices deliberately lowered, but the phrases "legal options" and "contest the will" drifted into the sunroom, chilling her to the bone. Her stomach churned, a knot of anxiety tightening within her at the thought of a protracted legal battle, of the Whitmore family tearing itself apart over their inheritance, over her unexpected presence in their carefully constructed world. Later that day, Mr. Whitmore called her to his study. He seemed stronger now, his color returning to his cheeks, his voice regaining its former resonance. "You've been quiet today, Alina," he observed, his piercing gaze meeting hers, his intuition as sharp as ever. "What's troubling you?" Alina hesitated for a moment, unsure how much to reveal, how much to burden him with the anxieties that weighed upon her. But Mr. Whitmore's gaze was insistent, his concern genuine. She sighed, A weary exhalation of breath. Mr. Whitmore, she began hesitantly. I overheard Mr. Mark and Ma'am Evelyn talking about contesting your decision. I don't want to cause problems for your family. Mr. Whitmore leaned back in his leather chair, his expression unreadable, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the window. Alina, he said finally, his voice calm, measured. My family has been causing their own problems for years. My decision is final. And if they want to challenge it, so be it. But don't you worry about them, Alina. You've done nothing wrong. Despite his reassurances, despite the unwavering certainty in his voice, Alina couldn't shake the unease that followed her throughout the day, a persistent shadow clinging to her heels. She had never been the type to seek confrontation, to engage in conflict, and the weight of the Whitmore family's hostility, the looming threat of legal action, pressed heavily on her spirit. Still, she continued her work, her quiet devotion unwavering, focusing her energy on Mr. Whitmore's continued recovery, finding solace in the familiar rhythm of her caregiving routine. A few days later, Evelyn made her move. She confronted Alina in the kitchen, the vast stainless steel space suddenly shrinking, suffocating under the weight of unspoken animosity. The air was thick with tension, heavy with unspoken accusations, as Evelyn leaned against the granite countertop, her arms crossed defensively across her chest, her posture rigid, confrontational. I don't know what you've done to manipulate my father, she began, her tone icy, her voice dripping with disdain, but don't think for a second that we'll let you get away with this. Alina set the knife she was using to chop vegetables down carefully on the cutting board, her movements deliberate, controlled. She turned to face Evelyn, her gaze steady, unwavering, despite the tremor of apprehension that ran through her. Ma'am, Alina said, her voice calm but firm, I've done nothing but care for Mr. Whitmore. If you think I've done something wrong, I'd be happy to talk about it. Evelyn scoffed, a short, derisive laugh that echoed in the sterile kitchen. Oh, you're happy to talk now, aren't you? She sneered, her voice laced with sarcasm. Convenient. After you've wormed your way into his will. Alina's chest tightened, a knot of hurt and indignation forming in her throat. But she kept her voice steady, her composure unwavering. With all due respect, ma'am, she replied, her gaze direct, unflinching, your father's decisions are his own. I've never asked him for anything. Before Evelyn could retort, before the simmering tension could escalate into open confrontation, Mr. Whitmore wheeled himself into the kitchen. His presence a sudden, imposing intrusion into their tense standoff. His sharp eyes darted between the two women, assessing the situation in a heartbeat. Evelyn, he said, his voice firm, commanding, cutting through the charged atmosphere like a blade. What are you doing? Dad, Evelyn began, her voice softening instantly, a veneer of filial concern replacing the icy aggression as she turned towards him. I'm just trying to protect you. She's taking advantage of you. Mr. Whitmore's voice rose, gaining strength, cutting through Evelyn's carefully constructed facade of concern. The only one taking advantage is you, Evelyn, he stated, his voice ringing with a righteous anger. You've ignored me for years. And now you're angry because someone actually cares enough to be here. Evelyn's face flushed crimson, a wave of anger and embarrassment washing over her. That's not fair, she exclaimed, her voice laced with wounded entitlement. Fair. Mr. Whitmore laughed, a short bitter sound that echoed in the kitchen. You want to talk about fair? Fair is Alina saving my life. When you were too busy to even answer your phone. Evelyn opened her mouth to respond, to launch into a counter-argument, to defend her own neglect, but seemed to think better of it, the weight of his words, the undeniable truth of his accusation, silencing her. With a huff of indignation, a final resentful glare directed at Alina, she stormed out of the kitchen, leaving Alina and Mr. Whitmore alone in the sudden charged silence. Don't let her get to you, Alina, Mr. Whitmore said softly, his voice regaining its gentler tone, his anger dissipating as quickly as it had flared. She's always been like this. More concerned about appearances than people. Alina nodded silently, her heart heavy, the emotional fallout of the confrontation settling upon her. Thank you, Pa, for defending me, she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. But I don't want to come between you and your family. You're not, he said firmly, his gaze unwavering, his voice filled with conviction. You're reminding them of what they've forgotten. That love and care matter more than money or status. The fallout from Evelyn's kitchen confrontation wasn't limited to her initial outburst. Over the next few days, Mark also began pushing back more forcefully against Mr. Whitmore's decision, his resentment simmering, his anger threatening to boil over. He called a tense, strained family meeting, dragging Nathan and Claire into the mix, attempting to present a united front against their father's unexpected testamentary act. Alina wasn't invited, of course, relegated to the periphery of their family drama, but she could hear the heated voices rising from the living room upstairs, muffled but unmistakable, the sound of their discontent echoing through the grand house. After the meeting finally broke up, the silence that followed was thick with unspoken tension, pregnant with unresolved anger. A few minutes later, Claire knocked softly on Alina's door, a hesitant tap that barely disturbed the quiet. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice soft, almost apologetic. Alina nodded, stepping aside to let her in, surprised by Claire's unexpected visit, by her willingness to bridge the chasm that separated them. "What happened?" Alina asked gently, her gaze searching Claire's face for clues, for understanding. Claire sighed, a weary exhalation of breath, sitting on the edge of Alina's bed, her usual teenage bravado replaced by a quiet vulnerability. "Dad's furious," she confessed, her voice low, confidential. "He's saying he might get a lawyer to fight Grandpa's decision." Alina's heart sank, a cold weight settling in her chest at the prospect of a protracted legal battle, of the Whitmore family tearing itself apart over her. "Oh, Claire," she murmured, her voice filled with distress, "I never wanted this. I just want what's best for him." "I know," Claire said, her voice sincere, her gaze meeting Alina's with a new level of understanding, a quiet empathy. "And, honestly, I think deep down, Dad and Mom know it too. They're just embarrassed, I guess. They know they haven't been there for Grandpa the way you have. And now, it's coming back to bite them." Alina looked at her, surprised by Claire's unexpected honesty, by her willingness to acknowledge the uncomfortable truths of her own family's dynamics. "Thank you, Claire," Alina said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. "That means a lot." Claire gave her a small, almost shy smile, a fleeting gesture of connection in the midst of the family turmoil. "You're a good person, Alina," she said quietly, her voice sincere. I wish they could see that. The way Grandpa and I do." The Whitmore family's protests, their simmering resentment, continued to cast a shadow over the estate, but so did Alina's unwavering dedication, her quiet acts of compassion. She knew she couldn't control how they felt, couldn't erase their wounded entitlement, but she could control how she responded, how she conducted herself in the face of their hostility. She chose grace, humility, and the same unwavering care that had always guided her actions, a quiet strength that spoke louder than any words. Little did she know, as she navigated the turbulent currents of the Whitmore family drama, that the storm brewing within their privileged world would soon lead to an unexpected resolution, a quiet reckoning that would leave everyone, even the most resistant Whitmores, utterly stunned. The final showdown, the moment of reckoning that had been brewing for weeks, came sooner than Alina expected. A week after Evelyn's kitchen confrontation, the Whitmore family gathered in the estate's grand dining room, a formal, almost theatrical setting for the unfolding drama. It was at Mr. Whitmore's insistence. He had requested everyone's presence, including Alina, a deliberate inclusion that sent ripples of unease through the already tense family dynamic. "You're part of this family now," he had stated firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument, his gaze unwavering as it met Alina's hesitant one, whether they like it or not. The tension in the dining room was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Evelyn and Mark exchanged whispered words, their faces etched with a mixture of anger and resentment. Nathan, as usual, retreated into his own world, scrolling mindlessly on his phone, his disinterest radiating outwards. Claire sat quietly, her expression a complex mix of curiosity and apprehension, her gaze flickering between her parents and Alina, a silent observer in the unfolding drama. Alina stood at the edge of the room near the doorway, unsure if she should sit, unsure if she even belonged at this table, but unable to leave, drawn into the vortex of the family's internal conflict. Mr. Whitmore cleared his throat, a sharp, deliberate sound that commanded the room's attention, silencing the hushed whispers, drawing all eyes to him. "I've lived a long life," he began, his voice steady, surprisingly strong, but tinged with a deep, underlying emotion. "And in all my years, I've learned that the most valuable things in life aren't possessions or titles. They're the people who stand by you when it matters most." Evelyn shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her gaze darting away, but Mr. Whitmore continued, undeterred, his voice gaining resonance, conviction. When I was at my lowest, Alina was there. She didn't hesitate. Didn't ask for anything in return. She treated me with dignity, compassion, and love. And that's why I made my decision. Mark leaned forward, his frustration evident, his voice laced with a thinly veiled impatience. Dad, we get it, he said, his tone dismissive. She's been helpful. But giving her part of the estate? It's too much. Mr. Whitmore met his son's gaze with unflinching resolve, his eyes holding a depth of emotion that silenced Mark's protests. No, Mark, he said, his voice firm, unwavering. What's too much is how little any of you have been there for me. You've treated me like a burden. Something to manage. Not someone to cherish. Alina reminded me of what it feels like to be seen, to be cared for. That's worth more than all the money in the world. Silence descended upon the dining room, a profound, weighty silence that stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Even Evelyn seemed at a loss for words, her usual sharp retorts failing her in the face of her father's quiet, unwavering conviction. Claire glanced at Alina, a small, almost imperceptible smile of encouragement gracing her lips, a silent affirmation of support. Taking a deep breath, gathering her courage, Alina finally spoke, her voice soft but clear, cutting through the heavy silence. Mr. Whitmore, she said gently, her gaze fixed on his, her voice trembling slightly but filled with genuine emotion. I appreciate everything you've done for me. But I never wanted to come between you and your family. I'm here to help you, not to cause problems. Mr. Whitmore smiled gently, a warm, knowing smile that chased away the shadows of tension that had darkened his features. You haven't caused any problems, Alina, he reassured her, his voice filled with affection. You've shown this family what it means to love, selflessly. And maybe, just maybe, they'll learn something from you. After the meeting, Mark and Evelyn retreated, their protests subdued, at least for the moment, but not entirely silenced. However, Claire stayed behind, lingering in the dining room, helping Alina clear the table, a quiet gesture of solidarity. You handled that well, Alina, Claire said softly, handing Alina a stack of plates, her voice filled with a newfound respect. I just want peace, Alina replied, her voice weary, her gaze distant. This family needs each other. Claire nodded thoughtfully, her gaze sweeping around the grand, yet somehow empty dining room. Maybe, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, but sometimes it takes an outsider to show us what we've been missing. As the weeks passed, the tension within the Whitmore family slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to ease. Mark and Evelyn, though still distant, still reserved, grew less overtly hostile towards Alina, their interactions shifting from outright resentment to a grudging, almost reluctant acceptance. Nathan remained largely indifferent, lost in his own world, but Claire became a surprising ally, a quiet bridge between Alina and the rest of the family, often stepping in to mediate when tempers flared, to smooth over the rough edges of their strained interactions. Meanwhile, Mr. Whitmore's health continued to improve, his recovery a testament to Alina's dedicated care and unwavering encouragement. He grew stronger, both physically and emotionally, regaining not just his physical vitality, but a sense of purpose, a renewed connection to life. He began spending more time with his grandchildren, even persuading Claire to join him for afternoon walks in the garden, their shared laughter a rare and precious sound in the quiet estate. Alina, too, found herself changing, evolving in ways she hadn't anticipated. For the first time in years, perhaps for the first time in her adult life, she felt a sense of belonging, not just in the Whitmore household, but in her own life, in her own skin. With the inheritance Mr. Whitmore had so generously, so unexpectedly bestowed upon her, she began to dream, to plan for her family's future with a newfound sense of agency, of possibility. She dreamed of bringing her children to the U.S., of finally reuniting her family after years of painful separation. She envisioned starting a small caregiving business of her own, a venture that would allow her to provide the same compassion, the same unwavering care she had given Mr. Whitmore to others in need, to build a community rooted in kindness and empathy. One sunny afternoon, as Alina was helping Mr. Whitmore tend to his roses in the garden, their laughter mingling with the buzzing of bees and the gentle rustle of leaves, Claire approached, a crisp white envelope clutched in her hand. This came for you, Alina, she said, handing it to her with a shy smile. Alina opened the envelope cautiously, her fingers trembling slightly as she unfolded the official-looking document inside. It was a formal letter, an official notification, the final transfer of the inheritance Mr. Whitmore had promised her, legally binding, irrevocably hers. Along with it, tucked into the envelope, was a handwritten note, penned in Mr. Whitmore's familiar, slightly shaky script. Alina, it read. You've changed my life in ways I can't put into words. This is just a small token of my gratitude. Use it to build the life you deserve. And remember, you're not just a caregiver. You're family. With love, Arthur Whitmore. Tears welled in Alina's eyes, blurring the ink on the page, blurring the vibrant colors of the garden around her. She looked up at Mr. Whitmore, her heart overflowing with gratitude, with an emotion that went beyond words. Thank you, Pa, she said softly, her voice thick with emotion, for everything. No, Alina, he replied, his voice warm, his gaze filled with affection. Thank you. You've given me a second chance at life. In the months that followed, Alina used the inheritance wisely, thoughtfully, her first priority always her family. She brought her children to the U.S., navigating the complex immigration process with a quiet determination, finally reuniting with Maya and Ben after years of heartbreaking separation. She started her caregiving business, Alina's Angels, employing other compassionate caregivers who shared her passion for kindness and attentive care, building a small but thriving enterprise rooted in human connection. And though life remained busy, demanding, filled with the challenges of building a new life, a new business, she always found time to visit Mr. Whitmore, who had become more than just a former employer, more than just a client. He was family, a beloved member of her extended, chosen family. The Whitmore estate, once a cold and distant place, a symbol of privilege and isolation, began to feel alive again, filled with warmth, with laughter, with the quiet hum of genuine human connection. And at the center of it all, at the heart of this quiet transformation, was Alina Reyes, a quiet, unnoticed hero, whose unwavering kindness, whose selfless devotion, had transformed not just one life, but an entire family, proving that true wealth lies not in possessions, but in the immeasurable value of human compassion.